Now it's time for Perspective on the programme. And my guest today is a Gambian woman who was subjected to female genital mutilation at the age of just 7. Later in life, she went on to study in the UK, where she began her campaigning for women's rights. She's now returned to the Gambia, where she's a major campaigner there. Fatou Baldeh is the founder and CEO of Women in Liberation and Leadership, or WIL. She talks to us today ahead of International Women's Day, which comes up this weekend. Thanks very much for being with us on the programme. I'm going to talk a bit about your work in Gambia in just a moment, but let's start off with your story, if we can. Tell us, first of all, what your childhood was like as a woman and as a girl growing up in Gambia.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. To be honest, growing up, I was never aware of the injustice or the different treatment between boys and girls, because this was very much the norm. It was normalized, so I didn't question any of those inequalities. And when I was between the age of 7 and 8, I always knew that young girls went through something that nobody spoke about. And I was told that I was going to visit a family together with my cousins and other female girls, rather, within my family. So we were taken to my uncle's home, and it was on the day that we were put in a queue. And then the first girl that went in blindfolded, I heard screams, and I kept wondering, this must not be something as exciting as they made it sound, because when we were going, we had our hair done, new outfits. We were told it was something special. But as soon as I started hearing the screams, I knew it wasn't something so special. So the next thing I knew, I was grabbed by a couple of women and I was pinned down on the floor and my genitals were cut. And for me, reflecting back to that day now, it's that there were many different issues there, because also after the cutting, and as you may already know, in the Gambian context, when FGM is performed, it's performed by an old woman without any knowledge of the human body, that they would use any equipments that they have sharp equipments like razor blades, like scissors to cut girls' genitals, but also there is no medication given to girls during the time or after. And I still remember that for me, and which is one of the things that is always stuck in my head, it was having to sit on hot water and salt every morning, because that was the only medication we were given. So imagine fresh cut wounds and you're having to sit on that, because they believe that that would prevent infections and stuff.
And then as you grew up, sorry to interrupt, but as you grew up, you went to the UK to study, didn't you? I mean, was it a sudden point in your life when you realised you wanted to campaign to try and change things for girls and women in Gambia?
Yes. So at first, when I learned about female genital mutilation, initially I was very defensive, and I didn't really see it as something harmful, because that was the first time I learned about the practice and how it was considered as a form of gender-based violence or violence against women. So through my journey at university, eventually, of course, I found out the impact that it has on women. And then I started campaigning against the practice within immediate family members, but also within friends. And that's how I went into the advocacy against FGM.
And then you made that decision, didn't you, quite relatively recently, to go back to the Gambia to work there. Why did you do that?
I knew that the practice in my country, as you stated with the statistics, is still very high. There was already a lot being done by other women-led organizations, but I felt with my educational background, as well as the work experience that I have gathered in the UK, it was only right to go back home and to give back to my communities and my country, not just addressing female genital mutilation, but other forms of gender-based violence and inequalities that affect women and girls.
Yeah, there are so many, aren't there? I mean, I was having a look on your website, some of the statistics, just to give our audience a bit more of an idea. 18% of women are pregnant in the Gambia before the age of 19. 40% of women think domestic abuse is acceptable. 60% illiterate. 76% have undergone female genital mutilation. I mean, the figures, when you hear them like that, are quite astounding, really, aren't they?
They are, but you also realize the intersectionalities between all these issues. There is a reason girls are being caught. I often say that female genital mutilation is one of the strongest indicator of the low status of women in a country. So it's not strange that women are being caught, women are being forced into very early marriage, and domestic violence. It's so normalized that women actually believe that if you leave the home without telling your husband, he has a right to beat you. Women believe that if you burn the rice while cooking, a man has a right to beat you. So those are so normalized within the country. And my work and a lot of other women, particularly in my generation, are trying to change those social norms that make it acceptable for such violence.
Yeah, there has already been some legislation, hasn't there? I mean, do you think attitudes are starting to change, or is it very, very difficult to persuade people to change?
So most of these things are deeply rooted within our culture. So it's very difficult to change. But with seeing more women educated, more women having access to higher and quality education, of course, we are seeing a big change in certain generations. But still, the prevalence of all these issues are still very high. And we need to continue fighting. And we do have legislations, but the legislations alone are not enough. We need to work at the grassroots, at a community level, to try to change those attitudes that make it possible and creating the environment for such violence.
Yeah, and tell us how you do that. You founded this organisation, didn't you? Women in Liberation and Leadership, as I said, or WILL. Tell us what your aim is and what you actually physically can do.
Okay. So we recognize, although when I came back, I really wanted to do work on FGM. But when I started speaking to women, women would had they like me when I found out about FGM. Many women didn't see FGM as an issue because nobody had made those links. So people were more interested about putting food on the table, about getting their children educated. So we realized that we can't address FGM alone if we do not incorporate these other issues that affect communities in general. So in that we create platforms at the community level where we have dialogues with our community members. And in that we also recognize the significance of working with men and boys, because for most mothers, when we speak to them, they may tell you, now I know that FGM is bad, but if I don't cut my daughter, nobody's gonna marry her. So it requires men to also stand up and say that actually I will marry a girl who is not caught. And they need to also realize how FGM affects women, but also how it affects society as a whole. Because when you cut girls, you are also minimizing their potential and also preventing them from achieving everything that they could.
And what reaction do you get from men? Because presumably some push back against you.
Absolutely. A lot of the attacks that I get, particularly online, are from men. But also, I again acknowledge that FGM it's a patriarchal issue. I am challenging everyday things that are normalized. I am challenging the status quo. So I do expect that reaction, especially if you're bringing new ideas, if you're trying to change mindsets and social norms. But we continue the fight. We try to look for different approaches that where we are not seen as fighting our own culture and tradition, but rather trying to change mindsets for the better of the whole nation.
Good to have you with us on the programme today. Nice to end on a positive note, at least. Fatou Baldeh, founder and CEO of Women in Liberation and Leadership, joining us there. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you for having me.